So in the face of all this disruption you've heard about from Jim, and I liked how Jim said that we're diminishing our advertising. I don't remember exactly how he said it, but I thought diminishing our print advertising and even our digital advertising numbers is sort of the easiest work we've ever done because it just seems to keep happening. So in this era, in Raleigh, we're thinking about how can we pay for our newsrooms completely with online subscriptions. What if we can figure out how to fund journalism through the digital audience it serves? There we go. I got it. What if we can figure out how to fund that journalism just through digital subscriptions? To do that, we have to be purposeful in connecting our audience with our journalists. Journalists have to have a seat at the table. And if they do, what does that mean for journalists and how we value them? And what does it mean for journalism? We're thinking about that a lot. Our new executive editor and Carolina's regional editor, Robin Tomlin, thank you, Jim Maroney, she's most recently of the Dallas Morning News, has set a goal for our newsrooms to pay for themselves completely with online subscriptions within 3 years. It has journalists thinking about what their job really is and about how they will be valued and what this means for journalistic values. Long gone are the days where journalists really worked in the absence of readers. That is, they determined what was important to be covered based on their own internal guideposts. Those were the days when journalists stayed confined to the world of content. That was their seat at the table. It was a small one. They were convinced that the readers were there, whether they really were or not. They owned that piece, but again, it was a small piece. Then came data, page views, time on site, unique visitors. It was data, and it did inform content decisions to a certain extent, but it was so broad that it really couldn't help us determine what our next story should be or where we should be focusing our resources and attention. Now add deep analytics, which is more than just raw data. It's really understanding from that data what are our readers really connecting with and what are they doing. When you start looking at data analytics and you start talking about how a story connects with the audience, and you start asking journalists to think about that and focus their attentions based on that information, now it's marketing. And they're really becoming a sort of marketer. And when you start doing that, some journalists start thinking you're pushing them far too far into the marketing world. If you're going to fund the newsroom on digital subscriptions, you do need to understand what causes a reader to pay. And so we started looking at a reader funnel. What moves a reader from awareness to experience to preference and paying? It's similar to our advertising marketing funnel that we talk about when we try to sell ad campaigns. When we start out talking to advertisers, we ask them where they think their audience is, and then we create campaigns to help move that audience down through the funnel until they make a buying actions. Reader funnels are pretty much the same thing. Readers start in that funnel with awareness. They may see a story on Facebook, they may see something on Twitter or get a link from a friend, and so they use our content occasionally. Then maybe they find that we cover something they really care about, and so they start following us on Twitter or they sign up for a newsletter. Now we're part of their media experience, and they're moving down through that funnel. So how do we take a reader from the experience level to the preferred level, where we are their go-to source? And then once we've got them there, how do we move them to take that buying action? And once they've subscribed, how do we further move them to start referring us to their friends? And then we can start moving those friends back through that reader funnel. In Raleigh, we've started that process. We have a long way to go because we're just starting to gather the data. It's the very beginning phase. We'll gather all the information, we'll funnel it through our data scientists. But while we're doing that and trying to understand better what stories we need to be focused on to move people through that funnel, we're going to start working with our journalists to change their behavior, to make sure they are truly audience-focused. It's a difficult thing for journalists right now because integrity, as we've talked about, is such a big issue. And we don't want to be seen as writing clickbait or producing fake news that is only there to push people through this funnel. But I think it's important that we start turning that conversation, and it can be done in a way that respects all that integrity. So we've developed a couple of key tools for our journalists. The first is an audience checklist. And this is devised to make sure that when you write that story, there is actually some audience there to connect with. And it has to be a significant audience, and it has to be an audience that you as the reporter are keenly aware of. So at the beginning of the process, a reporter and an editor sit down together, and they'll have this conversation. And it asks, who cares about this story, or who should care about this story? And if you want to cover, say, an education story, the answer can't be everybody who cares about education, because that's not truly an audience. So when you are creating the idea for your story, you're thinking about, is this going to connect with middle school students or the parents of middle schoolers who are in STEM programs? And as you start defining that audience, you have to figure out, is this an audience that's big enough for me to spend time on the story? And if it isn't, so if you get through who cares and you don't quite make it, and then you think, can I expand that audience? Can I expand the story and get a larger audience? Is that one way that I can pursue this? So if you move through the checklist and you can't get to the point where you can say, yes, that I have identified my audience, the answer really should be, go find another story. But you do have one last chance to be able to write the story you want to. If the story is not going to connect with a large audience, but it is going to be a story of significant impact, it might save a life, it might change a law, it might free an innocent person from prison, then we should write that story even if it's only focused on 3 people. And so yes, that would be a move on to the next checklist. And the next checklist for us is mission. If you get through audience, now you have to make sure that you can answer yes to one of these questions. Will a story break news that holds leaders or institutions accountable? Will the story break news that makes a concrete difference in the community or to people in it? Will the story tell readers something that will directly affect their lives and the lives of their families and friends? Will the story use extraordinary storytelling to bring a societal issue really to life? Or will this story attract an extraordinary amount of readers? And if you think about this mission checklist, you could not write a sports story until you got down to number 5. And so that's why it's important to appreciate that everything doesn't have to be a solid part of that hardcore journalistic effort. There are things that we write that are really just to help people engage, have fun, connect with other people in their community. And so that's why there's number 5 on the checklist. Also, on our big stories, where we think they're highly important and there's an important community that we need to reach, our reporters will have an engagement list that includes the names and contact information of all the affinity groups and people or leaders or influencers who might be interested in that story. So after the story is written, the reporter and the editors will send out the link from their story to those groups. Now that's truly marketing. That's sending out communication to drive interaction with the reader. And hopefully, if they're an advocacy group, they will spread it within their community. It's marketing, but it's marketing well within our journalistic endeavors. It's so that a journalist has impact with their story. So we think of it as really good marketing. So as we learn more and more about how data is informing us about what users are doing, how they're interacting, we will probably change some of the questions on both of these checklists. And as we figure out those answers, journalists will certainly be thinking about how this defines their value. If I, as a journalist, figure out how to answer all those questions and generate significant audience, and if I figure out what stories will drive readers through that funnel to take that buying action, if my stories are particularly good at that, don't I have more value to the organization? And I, as a publisher, think, yes, you do. And so what does that mean for compensation? What does that mean for how we start paying our journalists? Is it okay to compensate them when they grow our audience significantly? Or does that push them away from their journalistic mission and move them too far into the marketing world? We don't know, but we're certainly starting to have those conversations. I think that's important for us to be thinking about as we're learning what we learn, because journalists will quickly figure it out and start asking us those questions. And also, what does it mean for those journalists who are doing great work, but the work they're doing is really not the kind of work that moves a reader through the funnel? Does that mean that their work has less value? Should they be compensated less? I don't know that answer either. But those are all things we're starting to think about. Then there's one other thing we think about quite a bit, and that is in news deserts, the UNC School of Media said that because of all this disruption and the financial issues in the news industry, there are these places all around the country, small communities that no longer have newspapers because it couldn't be supported through advertising. So if we can start to figure out how to fund journalism on the backs of audience very directly, can we start eliminating news deserts and bring more local journalism back into our communities? And wouldn't that be grand? And isn't that really what it's all about? Thank you.